Welcome to What If Sleep Storian, where What If whispers timeless tales into dreams. Breathe deeply, let your mind soften, and drift into tonight's gentle story. What if time moved like honey through cobblestone streets, where mist dances with lamplight, and every footstep echoes with centuries of peaceful wandering? So dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let these whispered narratives carry you softly towards sleep. If this tale finds you drifting towards sleep's edge, let me know where in the world you're listening. These stories travel far on whispered winds. Give it a like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely like what I do here. In the early years of the 20th century, when the world still moved at the pace of horse-drawn carts and steam trains whistled their lonely songs across rolling hills, there existed a village that time seemed to have forgotten. Not forgotten in neglect, but forgotten in the most tender way, the way a grandmother forgets to scold because she's too busy admiring how the light catches in a grandchild's hair. This village, nestled deep in the heart of the Cotswolds, wore its centuries like a comfortable woolen shawl. The honey-coloured limestone cottages lined narrow lanes that curved and twisted with the whimsical logic of sheep paths. For indeed, sheep had traced these routes long before humans decided to follow their ancient wisdom. Each cottage seemed to lean slightly toward its neighbour, as if sharing secrets that had been whispered from roof to roof for generations. The year was 1913, and while the world beyond these rolling hills buzzed with talk of motor cars and electric lights, the village of Millbrook, yes, that was its name, though it appeared on few maps and fewer still could pronounce it quite right. Millbrook continued its eternal dance with the seasons. The Industrial Revolution had touched this place with the gentlest of fingers, leaving behind just enough progress to make life comfortable, but not so much as to disturb the deeper rhythms that had pulsed through these valleys since time immemorial. On this particular evening in late autumn, when the air carried the first whisper of winter's approach, a soft mist began to rise from the valley floor. It crept up the hillsides like a shy child seeking comfort, wrapping itself around the village with tender care. The mist had its own personality here. It was not the harsh, blinding fog of London's Thames, thick with coal smoke and urgency. No, this was countryside mist, sweet with the scent of damp earth and dying leaves, gentle as a mother's lullaby. The village street lamps, though lamps was perhaps too grand a word for these humble beacons, flickered to life one by one as dusk settled over the landscape. They were simple affairs, these lights, gas flames enclosed in glass boxes that cast pools of warm amber illumination along the cobblestone paths. Each lamp had been tended for decades by old Thomas Wickham, whose father had tended them before him, and whose grandfather had lit the very first ones when they were nothing more than oil flames dancing in the wind. Thomas moved through his evening ritual with the measured pace of a man who understood that some things in life should never be hurried. His footsteps echoed softly against the stones, a rhythmic tap, tap, tap that had become as much a part of the village's evening symphony as the distant lowing of cattle or the gentle splash of the mill wheel turning in the brook that gave the village its name. The wheel still turned, though the mill itself had long since ceased grinding grain for daily bread. Instead, it served now as a workshop for Eleanor Hartwell, the village's sole remaining artisan, who spent her days creating delicate pottery that seemed to capture the very essence of the Cotswold countryside in its glazes. Her hands, stained permanently with clay and blessed with an artist's intuitive understanding of form and beauty, shaped vessels that would grace the tea tables of gentle folk throughout the county. Eleanor had inherited more than just the mill from her father. She had inherited his way of seeing the world, through eyes that found beauty in the curve of a handle, in the way light played across a glazed surface, in the satisfying weight of a well-made cup settling into eager hands. Her pottery was not merely functional, though it served its purpose admirably. Each piece was a small meditation on the relationship between human creativity and the patient earth from which clay springs. The mill wheel's gentle turning provided a constant, soothing rhythm that helped Eleanor focus her thoughts as she worked. Today, she had been crafting a set of teacups for Mrs. Pemberton, the village's unofficial mayor. Unofficial because no such office existed in a place where decisions were made by consensus around kitchen tables, and problems were solved with the application of common sense and good humour. Mrs. Pemberton. Vivian to her close friends, though she insisted that even her dearest companions address her as Mrs. Pemberton in public, as befitted a woman of her standing, ran the village's small general store with the efficiency of a military quartermaster and the warmth of a beloved aunt. She had never married, despite the persistent attentions of no fewer than 3 suitors in her youth, preferring instead to dedicate herself to the care and feeding of an entire village's daily needs. Her store occupied the ground floor of a Tudor cottage that had housed merchants for over 4 centuries. The building itself seemed to sag slightly under the weight of so much history, its timber frame weathered to a soft grey that complemented the honeystone of its neighbours. The windows, composed of small diamond panes held together by lead strips, caught and reflected the lamplight in ways that made the entire building appear to wink at passers-by. Inside, the store was a marvel of organisation disguised as charming chaos. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with everything from buttons and thread to tinned sardines and imported tea. Mrs. Pemberton knew the location of every item by heart, could tell you without looking that the shoe polish was on the 3rd shelf behind the biscuit tins, that the writing paper lived in the drawer beneath the counter next to the sealing wax, and that the best honey, her own, made from the beehives she kept in her back garden, occupied a place of honour on the counter where its golden colour could catch the afternoon sun. The villagers had long since given up trying to understand Mrs. Pemberton's filing system. They simply presented their needs and trusted her to produce the required items with the flourish of a stage magician, and she rarely disappointed, though she did have a tendency to include unsolicited advice with every purchase. "Young Mr. Fletcher," she might say to the blacksmith's son, "you'll be wanting some throat lozenges with that tobacco. Mark my words, that cough of yours won't improve on its own, and your dear mother has enough to worry about without you hacking through the night like a consumptive poet." Her recommendations were generally sound, based as they were on decades of observing human nature and its various follies. She had watched children grow into adults, had celebrated marriages and mourned passings, had extended credit during lean times and celebrated during times of plenty. The store was more than a place of commerce. It was the beating heart of village life, the place where news was shared, gossip was refined into acceptable social currency, and the complex web of relationships that bound the community together was daily rewoven. On this misty autumn evening, Mrs. Pemberton was just closing her shop for the day, turning the hand-painted sign that hung in her window from open to closed, with the ceremonial gravity of a ship's captain lowering his colours. She paused for a moment to peer out at the gathering dusk, noting with satisfaction that Thomas was about his lamplighting duties, and that the mist was rising in just the way it should for the season. The mist held particular significance for the residents of Millbrook. They had learned to read its moods and messages like farmers read the sky for weather. A gentle evening mist like tonight's promised a clear, crisp morning, perfect for hanging laundry or taking long walks across the downs. A heavy morning fog meant rain before noon. A mist that came up suddenly in broad daylight meant visitors would arrive before sunset. Though why this should be so, none could say. It was simply one of those pieces of countryside wisdom that proved true often enough to be respected, even by those who considered themselves too modern for such superstitions. Tonight's mist whispered of peace and stillness, of early bedtimes and pleasant dreams. It moved through the village streets with unhurried grace, softening the edges of familiar landmarks and transforming ordinary sights into something approaching magic. The War Memorial, a simple stone cross erected just 2 years earlier to honour the 3 local men who had not returned from South Africa, seemed to float in its own pool of gentle light, the names carved into its base appearing and disappearing as wisps of vapour drifted past. The memorial stood at the village's small central green, a patch of grass barely large enough to host the annual May Day festivities, but perfectly sized for the community it served. An ancient oak tree dominated one corner of the green, its massive trunk scarred by centuries of weather and wear, but still producing enough acorns each autumn to keep the local pig population content and the children busy with their collection games. Beneath the oak's spreading branches sat a wooden bench, installed by the village council, which consisted of whoever happened to be present when decisions needed to be made. In memory of old Samuel Hartwell, Eleanor's grandfather and the village's longest-serving miller. The bench had been crafted by the current blacksmith James Fletcher, from timber taken from a barn that had finally surrendered to time and weather. James Fletcher was a man who understood that his role in the village extended far beyond shoeing horses and mending tools. In a community where most residents were jack-of-all-trades by necessity, the blacksmith served as combination metalworker, engineer, dentist in extremities, and general consultant on matters requiring both strength and ingenuity. His forge, located in a stone building that had housed smiths for longer than anyone could remember, provided not only essential services, but also a gathering place for men who needed somewhere to discuss the important matters of the day while appearing to conduct business. The forge itself was a thing of beauty to those who understood such matters. Built into the hillside to take advantage of natural draught, it featured a bellows system that James's grandfather had improved upon, and that James himself had further refined with innovations learned from a travelling tinker who had passed through the village some 15 years earlier. The fire burned steady and true, its heat controlled with the precision of a master chef adjusting the flame beneath a delicate sauce. James had learned his trade from his father, who had learned from his father before him, in an unbroken chain of knowledge passed down through generations of Fletchers. But he was not content to simply maintain tradition. He read voraciously, subscribing to technical journals and corresponding with smiths in other counties to learn new techniques and better ways of working metal. His innovations had improved the efficiency of farm tools throughout the district and earned him a reputation that extended well beyond the village boundaries. Yet for all his skill and knowledge, James remained fundamentally a man of his place and time. He rose with the sun, worked with his hands, and found satisfaction in creating useful things that would outlast their maker. His wife, Mary, often teased him about his philosophical moments, those times when he would pause in his work to contemplate the relationship between fire and metal, between human intention and natural law. Mary Fletcher was a woman who could have graced any drawing room in London, but had chosen instead to make her life in a Cotswold village, marrying for love rather than advancement and never regretting the decision. She had been born to gentry. Her father owned considerable property in Gloucestershire, but had fallen in love with James's combination of strength and gentleness during a visit to her aunt's estate neighbouring Millbrook. Their courtship had been the talk of the village for months, not because anyone disapproved. James was universally respected and Mary was genuinely charming, but because it represented something of a fairy tale romance. The blacksmith and the gentleman's daughter, love conquering social convention, beauty finding its match in honest labour. Their wedding had been celebrated with enthusiasm that spoke to the village's collective romantic soul. Now, 15 years later, they remained devoted to each other and to the community they served. Mary had adapted to village life with grace and good humour, learning to keep chickens and tend a garden, to preserve fruits and vegetables for winter, to mend clothes and manage a household on a blacksmith's income. She had also become the village's unofficial teacher, providing basic education to children whose parents were too busy with survival to manage formal schooling. The Fletchers' cottage, like most in the village, had been built in the 16th century and had acquired additions and improvements over the centuries as successive generations of occupants adapted it to their needs. The result was a building that defied easy architectural classification, but radiated comfort and functionality. Thick stone walls kept the interior cool in summer and retained heat from the large fireplace during winter months. Small windows, designed more for defence than illumination in earlier times, had been enlarged over the years to admit more light while maintaining the building's character. Tonight, warm light spilled from the Fletcher cottage windows, casting rectangles of gold onto the cobblestone path outside. Mary could be seen moving about the kitchen, preparing the evening meal with the efficient motions of someone who had performed these tasks thousands of times but still took pleasure in doing them well. James would be finishing his work at the forge, banking the fire for the night, and securing his tools with the methodical care of a craftsman, who understood that proper maintenance was the foundation of quality work. The evening meal was a sacred time in the Fletcher household, as it was throughout the village. This was when the day's work ended, and the evening's pleasures began, when families gathered to share food and conversation, to plan for tomorrow and reflect on today's accomplishments. The pace of life in Millbrook allowed for such rituals, demanded them even, for in a place where community bonds were essential for survival, the daily renewal of family connections was not a luxury but a necessity. As darkness settled more firmly over the village, the individual cottage windows began to glow like jewels scattered across black velvet. Each window told its own story to anyone who cared to observe. Here, a family gathered around their kitchen table, heads bent in conversation or prayer. There, a solitary figure sat reading by lamplight, turning pages with the careful attention of someone for whom books were precious commodities. Elsewhere, children pressed their faces to glass panes, watching the mist swirl past with the fascination that the young reserve for natural mysteries. The mist itself had thickened as the temperature dropped, transforming from wisps and tendrils into a more substantial presence that muffled sounds and softened the sharp edges of reality. Footsteps seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Voices carried strangely, sometimes seeming closer than they were, sometimes fading away as if their speakers had stepped into another world entirely. This was weather that encouraged introspection and quiet conversation, that made even the most sociable villagers content to remain indoors with their families and their thoughts. It was weather for storytelling and contemplation, for settling disputes and making peace, for acknowledging the deeper currents that ran beneath the surface of daily life. In the cottage that served as the village's unofficial social centre, the home of Mrs. Pemberton's sister, Mrs. Dorothy Ashworth, a small gathering had formed as it did most evenings when the weather encouraged indoor activities. Mrs. Ashworth, a widow whose husband had been the village's last official constable, had continued his tradition of informal evening salons where neighbours could gather to discuss matters of mutual interest. Tonight's gathering included the usual suspects: Mr. Geoffrey Whitman, the retired schoolmaster whose knowledge of local history was encyclopedic, Mrs. Sarah Finch, whose late husband had been the village's physician, and who retained enough medical knowledge to serve as the community's health consultant, and young Mr. Timothy Ashworth, Mrs. Dorothy's nephew, who worked as a clerk in the county seat but returned to Millbrook most evenings and weekends. The conversation, as was often the case, had turned to changes occurring in the wider world and their potential impact on village life. Mr. Whitman had been reading about developments in mechanical transportation and wondering aloud whether the village would eventually need to accommodate motor cars. Mrs. Finch expressed concern about reports of labour unrest in the industrial cities and hoped that such troubles would not spread to the countryside. Timothy, who had the privilege of observing county politics from within, assured them that rural areas remained largely untouched by urban controversies. These discussions served multiple purposes beyond mere exchange of information. They reinforced the villagers' sense of connection to the broader world, while simultaneously affirming their satisfaction with their chosen way of life. They processed external changes through the filter of local values and priorities, determining which innovations might be beneficial and which were better avoided. The gathering also provided an opportunity for the gentle exercise of village democracy. Though Millbrook had no formal government beyond the distant county authorities, it managed its affairs through consensus built in conversations exactly like this one. Issues were raised, opinions were shared, alternatives were explored, and gradually agreements emerged about appropriate courses of action. Tonight, the main item of business was the approaching Harvest Festival, an annual celebration that marked both the end of the agricultural year and the beginning of the season of indoor activities that would carry the community through winter. Planning such events required careful coordination of individual efforts and resources, a task that the villagers accomplished with the ease of long practice. Mrs. Ashworth had volunteered to organise the food contributions, a responsibility that required diplomatic skills of the highest order. Every family would want to contribute their signature dishes, but careful coordination was necessary to ensure a balanced menu and to avoid the social disaster of too many apple pies or insufficient savoury offerings. She approached this challenge with the strategic mind of a military commander and the tact of a seasoned diplomat. Mr. Whitman had agreed to prepare a brief historical presentation about harvest celebrations in the region, drawing on his extensive research into local customs and traditions. His talks were always well received, not only for their educational value, but for their ability to connect present-day residents with the long chain of human experience that had shaped their community. Mrs. Finch would oversee the decoration of the village hall, a responsibility that involved transforming a plain meeting room into a festive space worthy of celebration. Her artistic sensibilities, honed during years of creating a welcoming atmosphere in her late husband's medical practice, made her the obvious choice for this task. Timothy would coordinate the entertainment, recruiting musicians from among the villagers and organising games for the children. His youth and energy made him particularly effective at engaging the community's younger members, while his education and urban experience helped him introduce appropriate innovations to traditional activities. As the evening progressed and the mist continued to thicken outside, the conversation gradually shifted from practical planning to more philosophical topics. This was a natural progression in village social gatherings, as immediate concerns gave way to broader reflections on life, meaning, and community. Mr. Whitman, perhaps inspired by the atmospheric conditions outside, began sharing stories about the village's past, drawing on oral traditions that had been passed down through generations of residents. He spoke of the medieval monks who had first settled the valley, attracted by the combination of fertile soil, reliable water, and isolation from worldly distractions. He described the Tudor merchants who had built many of the existing cottages, growing wealthy from the wool trade that had made the Cotswolds prosperous for centuries. Mrs. Finch contributed memories of her late husband's stories about the villagers he had treated, tales that illustrated the resilience and mutual support that had always characterized the community. She spoke of epidemics weathered through collective effort, of individual tragedies softened by community care, of celebrations made more joyful by shared participation. Timothy, though the youngest member of the group, offered insights gleaned from his work in the county seat, observations about how Millbrook compared to other rural communities and why it had maintained its distinctive character, while others had changed dramatically in response to external pressures. Mrs. Ashworth, as hostess, guided the conversation with subtle skill, ensuring that everyone had opportunities to contribute while preventing any single topic from dominating the evening. Her drawing room served as neutral ground where differences of opinion could be aired safely and where the complex work of building community consensus could proceed in a civilized manner. Outside, the mist had become so thick that the street lamps were barely visible from Mrs. Ashworth's windows. The familiar landscape had been transformed into something mysterious and dreamlike, where known landmarks became suggestions rather than certainties, and where the imagination could fill in details that eyes could no longer discern. This transformation seemed to affect the conversation as well, encouraging the sharing of stories that might seem too fanciful for clear weather, but felt appropriate for a night when reality itself had become fluid and mysterious. Tales were told of strange lights seen on the downs during similar misty evenings, of voices heard calling from directions where no houses stood, of travellers who had taken shelter in the village during storms and then vanished without trace when morning came. These stories were not told with the intention of frightening anyone, nor were they presented as literal truth. Rather, they served as acknowledgement that the world contained mysteries beyond human understanding, and that sometimes the most important truths could only be approached through imagination and story. They were part of the village's oral tradition, threads in the complex tapestry of shared memory that bound the community together across generations. As the evening grew later and the mist continued to swirl outside the windows, the conversation began to wind down naturally. The practical matters had been addressed, the stories had been shared, and the subtle work of community maintenance had been accomplished. One by one, the guests began to take their leave, wrapping themselves in warm coats and scarves for the short journey through the mist to their own homes. The leave-taking process was itself a ritual, involving multiple expressions of gratitude for hospitality received, confirmations of plans made during the evening, and gentle inquiries about family members who had not been present. These extended farewells served to reinforce social bonds and ensure that everyone felt valued and included in the community network. Mr. Whitman was the first to depart, gathering his books and papers with the deliberate movements of a man accustomed to handling precious documents. His goodbyes were formal but warm, accompanied by promises to begin work immediately on his Harvest Festival presentation. He stepped out into the mist with the confidence of someone who had walked these streets for decades and could find his way home by touch and memory if necessary. Mrs. Finch followed shortly after, pausing to discuss with Mrs. Ashworth some details about decoration materials that would need to be gathered for the festival preparations. Her departure was marked by expressions of mutual affection that spoke to a friendship deepened by shared experiences of loss and renewal. She vanished into the mist like a character from a fairy tale, her footsteps echoing briefly before being absorbed by the thick air. Timothy lingered longest, helping his aunt clear away the tea things and discussing family matters that required privacy. His presence in the village represented continuity between generations, a bridge between the traditional ways of life that had sustained the community for centuries and the modern world that pressed increasingly against its boundaries. When Timothy finally took his leave, wrapping himself in a heavy coat and pulling his cap down against the moisture in the air, Mrs. Ashworth found herself alone with the mist and her thoughts. She moved through her house, extinguishing lamps and securing doors with the methodical care of someone who understood that these simple actions were part of the larger rhythm that sustained both individual households and the community as a whole. The cottage settled into nighttime quietude, its old timbers creaking softly as temperatures dropped, and the building adjusted to the changing conditions. These were friendly sounds, the voice of a house that had sheltered families for centuries and intended to continue doing so for centuries more. The thick stone walls that had been built to withstand medieval winters provided comfort and security, while the modern improvements, better windows, improved heating, gas lighting, made the ancient structure genuinely comfortable for contemporary living. Mrs. Ashworth paused at her bedroom window before drawing the curtains, peering out into the mist-shrouded village that had been her home for all of her 63 years. The scene before her was both utterly familiar and completely transformed by the weather conditions. She could barely make out the shapes of neighbouring cottages, their windows glowing dimly through the thick air like distant stars viewed through clouds. The sight filled her with a complex mixture of emotions that she would have found difficult to express in words. There was comfort in the knowledge that these same cottages had sheltered families through countless similar evenings, that the rhythms of daily life that sustained her had sustained generations of previous residents. There was satisfaction in the thought that the community she had helped to nurture and maintain was strong enough to weather whatever changes the future might bring. But there was also a touch of melancholy, an awareness that change was indeed coming whether the village was ready or not. Timothy's reports from the county seat suggested that the wider world was moving at an accelerating pace, that innovations in transportation and communication would eventually reach even the most isolated rural communities. The question was not whether change would come, but whether it would enhance or diminish the qualities that made places like Millbrook worth preserving. These thoughts carried Mrs. Ashworth towards sleep as she settled into her bed, listening to the sound of mist-muffled wind moving through the trees outside her window. The village around her was also settling into nighttime rest, lights being extinguished in cottage after cottage as families concluded their evening activities and prepared for another day of the patient work that kept their community alive and thriving. In the Fletcher cottage, James and Mary were having their own evening conversation, reviewing the day's activities and planning for tomorrow's responsibilities. James spoke of orders that needed to be completed, of a horse that required special attention for a difficult shoeing problem, of improvements he wanted to make to his forge equipment. Mary shared news from her informal teaching activities, stories of children's progress, and concerns about families facing particular hardships. Their conversation was intimate and practical, the kind of daily exchange that sustains long marriages and builds the foundation for successful partnerships. But it was also connected to the larger community conversation that had taken place in Mrs. Ashworth's drawing room part of the network of communication and mutual support that made village life both possible and meaningful. As they prepared for sleep, the Fletchers performed the small rituals that mark the end of each day. James checked the doors and windows, ensuring that their home was secure for the night. Mary banked the fire in their hearth, leaving enough coals to maintain warmth until morning, but reducing the flames to prevent any danger. These actions were practical necessities, but they were also symbolic gestures that marked the transition from public day to private night, from community responsibility to family intimacy. Throughout the village, similar scenes were being repeated as families concluded their daily activities and prepared for rest. Children were being tucked into beds warmed by heated stones or copper warming pans. Adults were performing the final tasks that would ensure their households were ready to face another day. The elderly were settling into sleep with the satisfaction of lives well lived and communities well served. The mist continued to swirl through the streets and around the cottages, creating an atmosphere that seemed to exist outside normal time. In such conditions, the village seemed suspended between past and present, a place where the accumulated wisdom of centuries could be felt as a tangible presence in the air itself. The stones that paved the streets had been worn smooth by generations of footsteps. The cottages held within their walls the echoes of countless family conversations, celebrations, and sorrows. This was a place where human life had achieved a sustainable rhythm, where the demands of survival had been balanced with the needs of the spirit, where individual ambitions had been harmonized with community welfare. It was not perfect. No human community ever is. But it was good in the way that simple things done well are good, satisfying in the way that work performed with skill and care is satisfying. Eleanor Hartwell, alone in her mill workshop, was putting the finishing touches on Mrs. Pemberton's teacup set, her hands moving with the practiced precision of a master craftsperson. The steady turning of the water wheel provided a rhythmic background to her work, a sound that had been part of this place for longer than anyone could remember. The wheel would continue turning long after everyone currently alive had been forgotten, just as it had turned before any of them were born. This continuity was part of what made village life meaningful. Individual lives were brief, but the community endured, each generation adding its contributions to the accumulated store of wisdom, skill, and tradition. Eleanor's pottery would outlast her, would grace tables and bring pleasure to people she would never meet. Her techniques would be passed on to others who would refine and improve them, just as she had built upon the knowledge inherited from previous generations of craftspeople. The teacups she was completing were more than functional objects. They were embodiments of human creativity and skill, representations of the relationship between artist and material, between individual vision and community need. When Mrs. Pemberton served tea to her customers in these cups, she would be participating in a ritual that connected her to centuries of human hospitality, to the fundamental act of sharing sustenance and creating social bonds through the simple act of drinking together. As Eleanor worked, the mist pressed against the windows of her workshop, creating patterns on the glass that shifted and changed like living things. The lamplight reflected and refracted through the moisture-covered panes, creating a display of light and shadow that was both beautiful and slightly otherworldly. The combination of mist, lamplight, and the ancient rhythm of the turning wheel created an atmosphere that seemed to exist outside ordinary time, a space where past and present merged into something eternal and unchanging. This was the magic of village life, not the spectacular magic of fairy tales, but the quiet magic of human continuity, of traditions maintained and passed on, of communities that endured because they found ways to balance change with stability, innovation with tradition, individual desires with collective needs. Mrs. Pemberton, in her cottage behind the shop, was reviewing the day's accounts and planning tomorrow's orders. Her record-keeping was meticulous, not just for business reasons, but because she understood that these records were part of the village's history, documentation of how people lived and what they needed to sustain their lives. Future historians, if they ever studied a place as small as Millbrook, would find in her careful notations evidence of a way of life that was already beginning to disappear from the modern world. The items she sold told the story of a community that was largely self-sufficient, but connected to the wider world through networks of trade and communication. The locally produced goods, Eleanor's pottery, honey from her own beehives, preserves made by village women from fruits grown in their own gardens, represented the community's ability to meet its own needs through local skill and resources. The imported items, tea from India, sugar from the Caribbean, spices from around the world, represented connection to the global economy that was increasingly linking even the most remote places to worldwide networks of production and consumption. The balance between local self-sufficiency and global connection was one of the factors that made life in Millbrook both stable and interesting, rooted in place but not isolated from the wider world. As she completed her evening tasks, Mrs. Pemberton reflected on the day's interactions with her customers, the small dramas and minor crises that made up the texture of village life. She had mediated a dispute between two farmers over boundary lines, had provided credit to a family facing temporary hardship, had listened to concerns about a sick child, and provided both practical advice and emotional support. These activities were as much a part of her role as the actual selling of goods. In a small community, business relationships were inseparable from personal relationships. Economic transactions were embedded in networks of mutual obligation and support. The shop was not just a place of commerce, but a centre of communication, a place where information was exchanged and community bonds were reinforced through daily interaction. The mist outside continued to thicken, transforming the familiar landscape into something mysterious and dreamlike. The village settled deeper into nighttime quiet, the sounds of daily activity giving way to the subtler sounds of a community at rest. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, its voice carrying clearly through the still air. Another owl answered from a different direction, and then another, until the night was filled with their ancient conversation. The owls were part of the village's extended community, residents whose lives intersected with human activities in ways that were mostly peaceful and occasionally beneficial. They helped control the rodent population that would otherwise threaten stored grain and garden crops. Their calls served as a kind of natural timepiece, marking the progression of night hours for anyone who lay awake listening. Tonight their voices seemed particularly clear and musical, perhaps because the mist carried sound in unusual ways, or perhaps because the atmospheric conditions encouraged closer attention to natural sounds. Their calls added a layer of wildness to the domestic tranquility of the village, a reminder that human communities existed within larger networks of life that extended far beyond the boundaries of cultivated fields and tended gardens. Dr. Hartwell's old cottage, Eleanor's family home, though she now lived alone there since her parents' deaths, stood at the edge of the village where the last garden walls gave way to open pasture. From her bedroom window, Eleanor could look out across fields that stretched toward the horizon, broken only by occasional copses of trees and the stone walls that divided one farm from another. Tonight, the mist had erased the horizon entirely, creating the illusion that the village existed in a small sphere of reality, surrounded by an infinite white void. The effect was both peaceful and slightly unsettling, like being wrapped in a soft blanket that blocked out the rest of the world. Eleanor found it conducive to the kind of deep thinking that came naturally during the transition between waking and sleeping, when the mind was free to wander through memories and possibilities without the constraints of daylight logic. She thought about the teacup she had finished that evening, about the satisfaction of work completed to her own exacting standards. She thought about her parents, about the skills and values they had passed on to her, about the responsibility she felt to maintain the traditions they had established, while also finding ways to express her own artistic vision. The mill had been in her family for 4 generations, each owner adding improvements and adaptations while maintaining its essential character and function. Eleanor was the first to use it primarily for artistic rather than practical purposes, but she understood that this change was part of the natural evolution of human activities, a response to changing economic conditions and social needs. The pottery she created served practical functions, but it also served aesthetic and social purposes that were perhaps more important in an age when basic survival needs were more easily met. Her teacups enhanced the pleasure of daily rituals. Her bowls made simple meals more satisfying. Her vases brought the beauty of flowers indoors where it could be enjoyed even during the harsh months of winter. This was meaningful work that contributed to the quality of life in ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. It connected her to the long tradition of human craftsmanship, to the fundamental drive to create objects that were not just functional, but beautiful, that expressed something essential about human creativity and the desire to transform raw materials into things of lasting value. As sleep approached, Eleanor's thoughts drifted toward dreams, carrying with them the satisfaction of work well done and the anticipation of tomorrow's creative possibilities. The sound of the water wheel continued its ancient rhythm, a lullaby that had soothed countless generations of millers and their families into peaceful rest. The mist outside continued its gentle dance, wrapping the village in its soft embrace and creating the perfect conditions for deep, restorative sleep. In cottage after cottage, families settled into the rhythm of nighttime rest, their dreams filled with the quiet satisfactions of lives lived in harmony with the natural world and in service to the enduring needs of human community. The village of Millbrook slumbered peacefully beneath its blanket of mist, each cottage a jewel of a warm light gradually dimming as its inhabitants surrendered to sleep's gentle embrace. The night air carried the mingled scents of wood smoke from banked fires, the sweet dampness of autumn earth, and the faint perfume of late-blooming roses that still graced a few cottage gardens despite the advancing season. In the distance, the church bell tower rose like a finger pointing toward heaven, its ancient stones worn smooth by centuries of weather, but still standing firm against time's patient erosion. The church itself, dedicated to St. Michael, and built in the 13th century on the foundations of an even older Saxon structure, served as the spiritual centre of the community in ways that extended far beyond formal religious observance. The Reverend Marcus Thornfield, who had served as the village's pastor for the past 12 years, was known throughout the district for his practical approach to spiritual matters and his deep understanding of rural life. He had grown up on a farm in neighbouring Gloucestershire and understood the rhythms of agricultural life, the way that spiritual needs changed with the seasons and the economic cycles that governed rural existence. His sermons were models of practical wisdom, addressing the real concerns of people whose lives depended on weather and harvest, who faced the constant challenges of making a living from the land while maintaining the social bonds that held their community together. He spoke of stewardship rather than dominion, of service rather than salvation, of the sacred that could be found in daily work well done and in acts of kindness performed without expectation of reward. Tonight, as the mist swirled around the church's solid stone walls, Reverend Thornfield sat in his study preparing Sunday's sermon, though his thoughts kept drifting to the atmospheric conditions outside his window. The mist transformed the familiar churchyard into something mysterious and otherworldly, softening the sharp edges of weathered headstones and creating pools of shadow among the ancient yew trees that had stood sentinel over the dead for longer than anyone could remember. The churchyard was a peaceful place even in broad daylight, but tonight it seemed to exist in a realm between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. The mist moved among the graves like gentle spirits, and Reverend Thornfield found himself thinking not of death, but of continuity, of the way that each generation built upon the foundations laid by those who had gone before. The names carved into the headstones told the story of the village across the centuries. Hartwell and Fletcher, Pemberton and Ashworth, families whose descendants still walked the same streets and tended the same fields that their ancestors had known. Death was a presence here, but not a frightening one. Rather, it was part of the natural cycle that governed all life, the final rest that came after a lifetime of useful labour. Reverend Thornfield's theological training had been rigorous, but his real education in ministry had come from 12 years of pastoral care in a small rural community where abstract doctrines had to be translated into practical guidance for people facing very concrete challenges. He had learned to comfort the grieving, to counsel the troubled, to celebrate with the joyful, and to find in each of these experiences a new understanding of what it meant to live a life of faith, in a world that was often difficult and always uncertain. His sermon for Sunday would focus on the parable of the talents, but he would interpret it through the lens of village life, talking about the different gifts that each member of the community brought to the common good. Mrs. Pemberton's gift for organisation and her generous heart, James Fletcher's skill with metal and his willingness to help neighbours with problems that extended far beyond blacksmithing, Eleanor Hartwell's artistic vision, and her ability to create beauty from common clay. These were talents in the truest sense, gifts that were meant to be shared rather than hoarded, abilities that grew stronger through use rather than weaker. The parable taught that those who used their talents wisely would be entrusted with even greater responsibilities, while those who buried their gifts out of fear or selfishness would lose even what they had. In a village like Millbrook, this teaching had immediate practical relevance. The community's survival depended on each member contributing their unique skills and knowledge to the common good. Those who shared their abilities found themselves more deeply integrated into the social fabric, more secure in their place within the community, more likely to receive help when they needed it themselves. As he worked on his sermon, Reverend Thornfield became aware of footsteps on the gravel path outside his study window. The steps were slow and deliberate, muffled by the mist but still audible to ears accustomed to the deep quiet of rural nights. He looked up from his writing to see a figure moving through the churchyard, barely visible through the thick air but recognisable by its careful, measured pace. It was Dr. William Ashford, the village's physician, making his way home after a late call to tend a sick child in one of the outlying farms. Dr. Ashford had been serving the medical needs of Millbrook and the surrounding district for nearly 20 years, travelling by horse and trap along muddy lanes and across open fields to reach patients who could not come to him. His practice required not only medical knowledge but also the skills of a detective, an engineer, and sometimes a diplomat. Rural medicine in 1913 meant working with limited resources, improvising treatments from available materials, and often serving as counsellor and comforter as healer. Dr. Ashford had learned to read not only symptoms but also social situations, to understand how poverty, isolation and family dynamics affected health outcomes. Tonight's case had been relatively straightforward, a child with a fever that had yielded to aspirin and cool compresses, but the journey through the mist had been challenging. The familiar landmarks that usually guided his travels had been obscured, forcing him to rely on his horse's superior night vision and sense of direction to find the correct path home. The horse, a steady mare named Patience, had lived up to her name during the difficult journey, picking her way carefully along the narrow lanes and never losing her sense of direction even when her rider could barely see beyond her ears. She was a veteran of countless night calls, trained to stand quietly outside cottage doors while her master attended to his patients, accustomed to all weather conditions and unflappable in the face of medical emergencies. Dr. Ashford had inherited Patience from his predecessor, an elderly physician who had impressed upon him the importance of a reliable horse in rural practice. Over the years, he had come to understand that Patience was as much a part of his medical team as his bag of instruments and medications. She knew the way to every farm and cottage in the district, could sense when a situation was urgent enough to require extra speed, and seemed to understand instinctively when discretion was required. Tonight, as they made their way through the mist-shrouded village, Dr. Ashford reflected on the case he had just completed, and on the broader patterns of health and illness that he had observed during his years of practice. The child's fever had been concerning to the parents, but not particularly dangerous to someone with medical training. A few decades earlier, however, such fevers had often proved fatal, especially in isolated rural areas where professional medical care was not available. The improvements in medical knowledge and practice that had occurred during his lifetime represented one of the most significant changes affecting village life. While the basic rhythms of agricultural existence remained largely unchanged, the introduction of better medical care, improved sanitation, and more effective treatments had dramatically reduced mortality rates and improved quality of life for rural populations. Dr. Ashford was proud to be part of this transformation, but he was also aware of its limitations. Medical science could treat many conditions that had once been fatal, but it could do little to address the social and economic factors that often contributed to poor health. malnutrition caused by poverty, injuries resulting from dangerous working conditions, stress-related illnesses brought on by economic uncertainty. These problems required social solutions rather than medical ones. This understanding had made him an advocate for public health measures and social reforms that went beyond traditional medical practice. He had worked with village leaders to improve water quality, had lobbied for better working conditions in local industries, and had provided education about nutrition and hygiene to families who had never had access to such information. His efforts had been largely successful, contributing to a noticeable improvement in the overall health of the community during his years of service. Infant mortality had declined, infectious diseases had become less common, and the general level of physical well-being had improved significantly. These achievements gave him deep satisfaction, a sense that his professional life had made a meaningful difference in the lives of people he cared about. As he guided patients through the village streets toward his own cottage, Dr. Ashford noted with professional interest how the mist was affecting the behaviour of other residents he glimpsed through windows. The atmospheric conditions seemed to encourage introspection and quiet activities, creating a village-wide atmosphere of calm that was conducive to rest and healing. This was one of the aspects of rural practice that he found most rewarding, the way that individual health was connected to community well-being, the way that social conditions affected medical outcomes, the way that his role as physician extended far beyond treating specific illnesses to include promoting the general welfare of the entire community. His cottage, when it finally emerged from the mist, was a welcome sight after the challenging journey through the fog. The building had been specifically chosen for its location near the centre of the village, making it easily accessible to patients who needed to reach him quickly. The ground floor had been converted into a surgery and consultation room, while the upper floor served as his living quarters. The cottage itself was typical of the village's architectural style. Honey-coloured limestone walls, a slate roof that had been renewed twice during his occupancy, small windows with diamond-shaped panes, and a front garden where he grew medicinal herbs alongside the more decorative flowers that provided pleasure for their own sake. The herb garden was one of Dr. Ashford's particular interests, a hobby that had developed into a serious study of traditional plant remedies and their relationship to modern pharmaceutical preparations. Many of the medications he prescribed had their origins in folk remedies that had been used for centuries, and he found it both intellectually interesting and practically useful to understand these connections. Tonight, as he settled patients in her stable behind the cottage and gathered his medical bag from the trap, Dr. Ashford could smell the lingering fragrances of his herb garden despite the mist. Lavender and rosemary, chamomile and thyme, each plant contributing its distinctive scent to the complex bouquet that identified his home as clearly as any street address. Inside the cottage, he went through the familiar routine of concluding a medical call, washing his hands thoroughly, cleaning and organising his instruments, making notes about the case in his medical journal, and preparing for whatever emergency might arise during the remaining hours of the night. The medical journal was more than just a record of individual cases. It was part of Dr. Ashford's contribution to the broader development of medical knowledge, a careful documentation of health patterns in a specific rural community that might prove useful to other physicians facing similar challenges. He had been corresponding with colleagues in other districts, sharing observations and comparing experiences as part of an informal network of rural practitioners who were working to improve medical care in underserved areas. These exchanges had proven valuable in numerous ways, providing access to new treatment methods, confirming the effectiveness of established practices, and creating a sense of professional community among physicians who often worked in isolation. Dr. Ashford had learned as much from his correspondence with colleagues as from his formal medical training, and he made sure to share his own experiences freely with others who might benefit from them. As he completed his evening tasks, Dr. Ashford became aware of the deep quiet that had settled over the village. The mist seemed to muffle all sounds, creating an atmosphere of profound peace that made even his own movements seem intrusive. It was the kind of night that encouraged early sleep and pleasant dreams, when the body's natural rhythms aligned perfectly with the external conditions to promote deep, restorative rest. He moved through his cottage, checking doors and windows, banking the fire in his sitting room, and preparing for sleep with the methodical care of someone whose profession had taught him the importance of being ready for emergencies at any hour. His medical bag sat by the front door, fully stocked and organised for quick departure. A lamp and matches waited on the bedside table for middle-of-the-night calls. But tonight, he hoped, would be peaceful. The child he had just treated was resting comfortably, the fever broken and the crisis past. No other urgent cases were pending, and the atmospheric conditions seemed to discourage the kind of accidents and emergencies that often brought him out in the middle of the night. As he settled into his bed, Dr. Ashford reflected on the day's work, and on the broader patterns of life in the village he had chosen to serve. There was deep satisfaction in rural medical practice, a sense of being genuinely needed and appreciated that was sometimes lacking in urban settings, where patients were more likely to be anonymous cases rather than neighbours and friends. The relationships he had built with his patients over 20 years of practice were one of the greatest rewards of his professional life. He had delivered children who were now adults, had treated families through multiple generations, had shared in celebrations and sorrows that mark the passages of rural life. His patients trusted him not only with their physical health, but with their fears, their hopes, and their most intimate concerns. This trust was both a privilege and a responsibility that he took seriously. In a small community, the physician occupied a unique position of authority and influence that extended far beyond medical matters. People looked to him for guidance on a wide range of issues, sought his opinion on matters of public policy, and expected him to serve as an advocate for community welfare. He had tried to fulfill these expectations while maintaining appropriate professional boundaries, to serve the community's needs while preserving his own integrity and judgment. It was a delicate balance, requiring diplomatic skills that had not been part of his medical training, but that were essential for successful rural practice. The mist outside continued its gentle dance around the cottage, creating patterns on the windows that shifted and changed like living things. The sight was both beautiful and slightly hypnotic, conducive to the kind of peaceful reflection that prepared the mind for sleep. Dr. Ashford found himself thinking not of medical cases, but of the broader questions that had always interested him. The relationship between individual health and community well-being, the ways that social conditions affected physical outcomes, the role of the physician in promoting not just medical care but human flourishing. These were questions without easy answers, but they gave meaning and purpose to his work that went beyond the simple treatment of illness and injury. They connected his daily practice to larger issues of social justice and human welfare, making him feel that his profession was not just a way of making a living, but a form of service to something greater than himself. As sleep approached, Dr. Ashford's thoughts drifted toward dreams, carrying with them the satisfaction of useful work completed and the anticipation of tomorrow's opportunities to heal and help. The sound of his own breathing mingled with the subtle sounds of the cottage settling for the night, creating a rhythm that was both personal and universal, individual and eternal. Meanwhile, in another part of the village, Mrs. Pemberton was experiencing her own version of the peaceful transition from day to night. Her cottage, situated behind the shop she'd operated for more than 30 years, was filled with the accumulated treasures of a lifetime spent in service to her community. The rooms were small but comfortable, furnished with pieces that had belonged to her parents and grandparents, decorated with gifts from grateful customers, and organised with the same systematic efficiency that characterised her business practices. Every object had its place and its purpose, every surface was clean and well maintained, every detail reflected the habits of someone who took pride in creating order and beauty from the materials of daily life. Her evening routine was as methodical as her business operations, involving a careful review of the day's activities, preparation for tomorrow's responsibilities, and attention to the small domestic tasks that maintained her household in perfect order. She moved through these activities with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed them thousands of times, but still found satisfaction in doing them well. Tonight, however, the routine was enhanced by the atmospheric conditions outside. The mist transformed familiar views from her windows into something mysterious and beautiful. creating a sense of separation from the ordinary world that encouraged contemplation and peaceful reflection. Mrs. Pemberton had never married, a choice that had occasioned considerable comment in her younger years, but was now accepted as part of her distinctive character. She had received several proposals, including one from a prosperous merchant in the county seat, who would have provided financial security and social advancement. But she had chosen instead to remain in the village, to build her own business, and to create a life of independence and service that satisfied her personal values and ambitions. This choice had required considerable courage in an era when unmarried women faced significant social and economic challenges. Mrs. Pemberton had succeeded through a combination of business acumen, social skill, and sheer determination, building her shop into the commercial and social centre of the village while maintaining her personal integrity and independence. Her success had not gone unnoticed by other women in the community, particularly the younger ones who were beginning to question traditional assumptions about marriage and women's roles. Mrs. Pemberton had become something of a mentor and advisor, offering practical guidance and moral support to women who were exploring alternatives to conventional life paths. These relationships were among the most satisfying aspects of her life, providing opportunities to share the wisdom she had gained through experience while learning from younger perspectives on changing social conditions. She had watched young women make choices that would have been unthinkable in her own youth, had seen them succeed in endeavours that had once been closed to female participation, had witnessed the gradual expansion of opportunities and expectations that was transforming women's lives throughout British society. As she prepared for sleep, Mrs. Pemberton reflected on these changes and on her own role in facilitating them. Her shop had served not only as a place of business, but as a centre of communication and support, a place where women could gather to discuss their concerns, share their experiences, and draw strength from collective wisdom and mutual encouragement. The mist outside seemed to create a boundary around her cottage, separating it from the outside world and creating a space for private reflection. Mrs. Pemberton found herself thinking about the choices she had made, the life she had built, and the legacy she hoped to leave for future generations of village women. She had no children of her own, but she'd served as mentor and surrogate mother to dozens of young people over the years, had provided guidance and support during difficult times, had celebrated achievements and offered comfort during failures. These relationships had given her life meaning and purpose that was perhaps more fulfilling than traditional motherhood might have been. Her business records, carefully maintained over 3 decades, told the story not just of commercial transactions, but of a community's growth and development. They documented changing patterns of consumption, evolving tastes and preferences, and the gradual integration of the village into larger economic networks. Future historians, if they ever studied the economic development of rural England, would find in her ledgers valuable evidence of how small communities adapted to the challenges and opportunities of the modern world. But the records also told more personal stories. The credit extended during difficult times, the special orders placed for important celebrations, the careful attention to individual needs and preferences that had made her shop indispensable to the community's daily life. These were the stories that mattered most to Mrs. Pemberton, the evidence that her work had made a real difference in the lives of people she cared about. As she settled into her bed, Mrs. Pemberton could hear the mist moving against her windows, creating soft sounds that were almost musical in their rhythm and variation. The cottage around her held the accumulated memories of a lifetime spent in useful service, and she found deep satisfaction in the knowledge that her work had contributed to the welfare and happiness of her community. Her dreams, when they came, were filled with images of the village as it had been when she first took over the shop, as it was now, and as it might become in the future. She saw familiar faces aging and changing, saw new families arriving and old ones departing, saw the eternal cycle of growth and renewal that kept communities alive across the generations. The mist continued its gentle movement through the village streets, touching each cottage with its soft presence and creating an atmosphere of unity and peace that seemed to embrace the entire community. In cottage after cottage, residents were settling into sleep, their dreams filled with the quiet satisfactions of lives lived in harmony with natural rhythms and social responsibilities. In the Fletcher cottage, James and Mary were engaged in their own evening conversation, discussing the day's activities and planning for tomorrow's work. their relationship strengthened by 15 years of marriage and tested by the inevitable challenges of rural life, had evolved into the kind of partnership that was both practical and romantic, both deeply personal and thoroughly integrated into community life. James spoke of a complex project he was undertaking for a neighbouring farm, a piece of specialised equipment that would require all of his skill and experience to complete successfully. The work interested him not only for its technical challenges, but for its potential to improve agricultural efficiency in the district. He took pride in creating tools that would outlast their maker, that would serve farmers for generations and contribute to the ongoing productivity of the land. Mary shared news from her informal teaching activities, stories of children's progress and concerns about families facing particular hardships. Her work with young people was entirely voluntary, motivated by her belief that education was the key to individual advancement and community development. She had seen remarkable transformations in children who'd been given opportunities to develop their natural abilities, had watched young people grow into productive adults who contributed significantly to community welfare. Their conversation was intimate and practical, the kind of daily exchange that sustained successful marriages and built the foundation for lifelong partnerships. But it was also connected to the larger community conversation that had taken place earlier in Mrs. Ashworth's drawing room, part of the network of communication and mutual support that made village life both possible and meaningful. As they prepared for sleep, the Fletchers performed the small rituals that marked the end of each day and the beginning of night's rest. These actions were practical necessities, but they were also symbolic gestures that marked the transition from public responsibility to private intimacy, from community service to family connection. The mist outside their windows created an atmosphere of enclosure and protection, as if their cottage had been wrapped in a soft blanket that shut out the larger world and created a space for rest and renewal. James and Mary found the conditions particularly conducive to the kind of quiet conversation that deepened their understanding of each other and strengthened their partnership. They spoke of dreams and ambitions, of hopes for the future and memories of the past, of the small daily pleasures that made life meaningful and the larger purposes that gave their work significance. These conversations were among the most precious aspects of their marriage, moments of connection that sustained them through difficulties and enhanced their joy during good times. As sleep approached, they settled into the comfortable rhythm of long marriage, each knowing without words what the other needed for peaceful rest. The sound of their synchronized breathing mingled with the subtle sounds of the cottage settling for the night, creating a harmony that was both personal and universal, individual and eternal. Throughout the village, similar scenes were being repeated as families concluded their daily activities and prepared for rest. Children were being tucked into beds warmed by heated stones or copper warming pans, their parents telling stories or singing lullabies that had been passed down through generations of village families. The stories were often about the village itself, tales of its founding and development, of notable residents and memorable events, of the relationships between human inhabitants and the natural world that sustained them. These stories served multiple purposes. They entertained children and helped them fall asleep. They transmitted cultural values and historical knowledge, and they reinforced the sense of belonging and continuity that was essential for community cohesion. Adults were performing the final tasks that would ensure their households were ready to face another day, checking doors and windows, banking fires, preparing breakfast items for morning preparation. These activities were practical necessities, but they were also ritual acts that marked the transition from day to night and affirmed the ongoing commitment to family welfare and community responsibility. The elderly were settling into sleep with the particular satisfaction that comes from lives well lived and communities well served. Many of them had witnessed dramatic changes during their lifetimes, had seen the village evolve from a more isolated and primitive place into the comfortable and well-organised community it had become. Their memories held the stories of this transformation, the struggles and achievements that had shaped the present reality. These stories were part of the village's living history, transmitted through informal conversations and family traditions, preserved in the collective memory of residents who understood that they were custodians of something precious that needed to be maintained and passed on to future generations. Eleanor Hartwell, alone in her mill cottage, was putting the finishing touches on her evening's work, cleaning her tools and organising her workspace for tomorrow's creative activities. The steady rhythm of the water wheel provided a constant background to her thoughts, a sound that connected her to the long tradition of human work in harmony with natural forces. The mill itself was more than just a workplace. It was a symbol of the relationship between human ingenuity and natural power, between individual creativity and community need. The wheel that powered her pottery wheel had been turning for centuries, had served her grandfather and his predecessors, would continue serving future generations long after she was gone. This continuity was deeply meaningful to Eleanor, connecting her work to something larger and more enduring than individual achievement. Her pottery was part of an ongoing conversation between past and present, between tradition and innovation, between the accumulated wisdom of previous generations and the creative vision of contemporary artists. As she prepared for sleep, Eleanor reflected on the day's work and on the deeper questions that gave her life meaning and purpose. Her art was more than just the creation of beautiful objects. It was an exploration of the relationship between human creativity and the natural world, between individual expression and community service, between the practical needs of daily life and the spiritual hunger for beauty and meaning. The mist outside her windows seemed to enhance these reflections, creating an atmosphere that was conducive to the kind of deep thinking that came naturally during the transition between waking and sleeping. The familiar landscape had been transformed into something mysterious and otherworldly, encouraging the kind of imaginative leaps that were essential for artistic creation. Her dreams, when they came, were filled with images of clay and fire, of wheels turning and hands shaping, of the ancient alchemy that transformed raw earth into objects of utility and beauty. These were the dreams of someone whose work was deeply integrated into their sense of identity and purpose, whose creativity was inseparable from their understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. The mist continued its gentle dance through the village streets, touching each building with its soft presence and creating an atmosphere of unity and peace that seemed to embrace the entire community. The street lamps, tended earlier by old Thomas Wickham, glowed like friendly beacons through the thick air, providing just enough light to make navigation possible, while preserving the mysterious quality that made the night so beautiful. Thomas himself was long asleep in his cottage near the village green, his day's work completed with the satisfaction that came from duties faithfully performed. His role in maintaining the village's lighting system was more than just practical service. It was part of the network of care and responsibility that kept the community functioning smoothly and safely. The lamps he tended had been installed by his grandfather, had been improved by his father, and would eventually be maintained by someone else, when Thomas was no longer able to perform the task. This continuity of service was part of what made village life stable and reliable, part of the web of mutual dependence that bound individual residents into a cohesive community. As the night deepened and the mist continued to swirl through the streets, the village settled into the deep quiet that came only during the most peaceful evenings. The sounds of daily activity had given way to the subtler sounds of a community at rest. The soft settling of old buildings, the distant call of owls, the gentle whisper of wind moving through trees and gardens. These were the sounds of a place where human life had achieved a sustainable balance with natural rhythms, where the demands of survival had been met without destroying the qualities that made life worth living. The village slept peacefully beneath its blanket of mist, secure in the knowledge that morning would bring another day of useful work and meaningful community. And as the residents of Millbrook drifted into dreams filled with the quiet satisfactions of lives well lived, the mist continued its ancient dance, weaving through streets and around cottages, connecting past and present in its gentle embrace, reminding all who witnessed its beauty that some things in this world remained constant and comforting, even as everything else continued to change. The night grew deeper, the mist grew thicker, and the village slept on, dreaming dreams of continuity and peace, of work well done and communities well served, of the eternal rhythms that sustained human life in harmony with the natural world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight there was only rest and peace, and the gentle certainty that some places in this world would always be home to the human spirit. The night grew deeper still, and with it came the most profound quiet that Millbrook had known in months. The mist had transformed from gentle wisps into a substantial presence that seemed to hold the entire village in a soft, protective embrace. It was the kind of night that reminded residents why they had chosen to make their lives in this particular corner of the world, why they had remained when opportunities in the cities beckoned, why they found satisfaction in the rhythm of rural life despite its challenges and limitations. In the cottage that served as the village's informal library, for Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, the rector's elderly aunt, had accumulated over the decades the finest collection of books in the district. A single lamp still burned in an upstairs window. Mrs. Thornton, now in her 78th year, had never quite adjusted to the early bedtimes that seemed natural to most village residents. Her mind remained sharp and curious, hungry for the intellectual stimulation that books provided, reluctant to surrender consciousness to sleep when there were still stories to be read and ideas to be explored. Tonight she was reading a volume of poetry by William Wordsworth, drawn as she often was to verses that celebrated the relationship between human consciousness and the natural world. The poem seemed particularly appropriate for an evening when mist had transformed familiar landscapes into something magical and otherworldly, when the ordinary boundaries between reality and imagination had become fluid and permeable. Mrs. Thornton had been a teacher before her marriage, had spent her youth educating the children of prosperous families in Bath and London, before choosing to settle in Millbrook when her husband inherited property in the district. She'd continued her educational work informally, serving as tutor and mentor to village children whose parents recognised the value of learning but lacked the resources to provide formal schooling. Her cottage library reflected a lifetime of careful collecting, of choosing books not for their monetary value but for their intellectual and spiritual worth. The volumes range from classical literature to contemporary fiction, from works of history and philosophy to practical guides for agriculture and domestic management. Every book had been selected with care, had been read multiple times, had been shared with others who might benefit from its contents. The library served as more than just a personal collection. It was a community resource, though Mrs. Thornton was selective about who received borrowing privileges. She believed that books were precious things that deserved respectful treatment, that reading was a privilege that carried responsibilities, that knowledge was meant to be shared but only with those who would value and preserve it. Her standards were high but not exclusionary. She had lent books to farm labourers who showed genuine interest in self-improvement, had guided servant girls through novels that opened their minds to possibilities beyond their immediate circumstances, had provided technical manuals to craftsmen who wanted to refine their skills. Her only requirements were that borrowers treat the books with care and return them in good condition so that others might benefit from them. Tonight, as she read by lamplight while mist swirled past her windows, Mrs. Thornton reflected on the power of literature to transport readers beyond the limitations of their immediate circumstances. The poetry she was reading had been written about landscapes not unlike those surrounding Millbrook, by a man who had found in natural beauty sources of spiritual inspiration and philosophical insight. The words seemed to resonate with particular force on a night when the familiar world had been transformed by atmospheric conditions into something approaching the sublime. The mist had erased the harsh edges of reality, had softened the boundaries between earth and sky, between solid ground and infinite space, creating conditions that made the poet's vision seem not just beautiful, but literally true. Mrs. Thornton had always believed that education should do more than simply transmit factual information. It should cultivate the imagination, develop aesthetic sensibilities, and provide tools for understanding the deeper meanings that gave human life purpose and direction. Her informal teaching had emphasized these goals, introducing students to literature and poetry not as academic exercises, but as windows into enlarged possibilities for living. Many of her former students had moved away from the village, pursuing opportunities in cities or emigrating to distant countries, where their educations could provide advantages not available in rural England. But they maintained correspondence with her, sharing news of their achievements and often crediting her influence for whatever successes they had achieved. These letters were among Mrs. Thornton's greatest treasures, evidence that her work had made a lasting difference in lives that might otherwise have remained bounded by the limitations of rural poverty and social convention. She kept the letters in a special box, organised by date and student, creating a record of how education could transform individual destinies and contribute to the larger progress of human civilization. As the night deepened and her reading candle burned lower, Mrs. Thornton became aware of sounds that seemed to emerge from the mist itself. The distant lowing of cattle, the soft splash of water over the mill wheel, the almost inaudible whisper of wind moving through grass and leaves. These were the sounds of a landscape that had been shaped by centuries of human habitation, but that retained its essential wildness, its connection to natural forces that existed independent of human purposes and plans. The combination of poetry and atmospheric conditions created a mood of profound contemplation, encouraging the kind of deep reflection that was essential for wisdom, but often crowded out by the demands of daily life. Mrs. Thornton found herself thinking about the larger patterns that governed human existence, about the relationship between individual lives and historical forces, about the ways that places like Millbrook served as refuges for values and ways of life that were increasingly threatened by the pace of modern change. She had lived through extraordinary transformations during her 78 years, had witnessed the introduction of railways and telegraphs, had seen the expansion of democratic institutions and the gradual improvement of living conditions for ordinary people. These changes had brought undeniable benefits, but they had also disrupted traditional patterns of life that had provided stability and meaning for countless generations. Villages like Millbrook represented continuity in a world of accelerating change, preservation of human-scale communities, where individual relationships remained more important than abstract institutions, where work retained its connection to tangible results and measurable benefits. They were not perfect places, no human communities ever were, but they offered something increasingly rare in the modern world, the possibility of living in harmony with natural rhythms while maintaining the social bonds that made civilization possible. As her candle flickered lower and sleep finally began to claim even her resistant consciousness, Mrs. Thornton closed her book of poetry and prepared for rest. The mist outside seemed to be settling deeper over the village, creating an atmosphere of perfect peace that promised pleasant dreams and restful sleep for all who surrendered to its gentle influence. Her cottage, like all the others in Millbrook, settled into nighttime quiet, its old timbers creaking softly as temperatures dropped and the building adjusted to changing conditions. These were comfortable sounds, the voices of structures that had sheltered families for centuries and intended to continue doing so for centuries more. The entire village now rested beneath its blanket of mist, each cottage a jewel of dimming light gradually surrendering to darkness as inhabitants yielded to sleep's irresistible embrace. The street lamps continued their faithful vigil, casting pools of amber illumination through the thick air, but their light seemed softer now, more gentle, as if the lamps themselves understood that their primary purpose was no longer navigation, but comfort, providing reassurance that human presence and care continued even in the deepest hours of night. Thomas Wickham's work had been completed hours earlier, but the lamps he had lit continued their steady burning, fulfilling their purpose with the reliability that characterized all well-made things properly maintained. The light they provided was not harsh or demanding. It was gentle and welcoming, a reminder that even in the midst of natural mystery and atmospheric transformation, human wisdom and human care continued to provide guidance and safety. The mist itself seemed to be responding to the village's surrender to sleep, settling more deeply into the valleys and hollows, creating an even thicker barrier between Millbrook and the outside world. The effect was to make the village feel completely enclosed, protected, separate from whatever troubles or anxieties might exist beyond its boundaries. This was a night for deep sleep and pleasant dreams, for the kind of restorative rest that prepared both body and spirit for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The atmospheric conditions, the community harmony, the satisfaction of work well done and relationships well maintained, all combined to create perfect conditions for the renewal that came only through complete surrender to sleep's healing embrace. In cottage after cottage, residents settled into the final phase of their evening rituals. Children who had already been tucked into their beds hours earlier slept soundly, their dreams filled with the simple pleasures of childhood in a place where safety and security were taken for granted. Parents completed their final tasks and joined their children in sleep, confident that morning would bring another day of meaningful work and community fellowship. The elderly, those who'd contributed decades of service to the village's welfare, settled into rest with the particular satisfaction that comes from lives well lived and responsibilities faithfully discharged. Their dreams carried the accumulated wisdom of long experience, the deep contentment that comes from understanding one's place in the larger patterns of human existence. Young adults, those who stood at the threshold between childhood dependence and adult responsibility, found in sleep a respite from the anxieties and uncertainties that inevitably accompanied their transition into full community membership. Their dreams explored possibilities and rehearsed futures, preparing them for the choices that would shape their adult lives and determine their contributions to the community's ongoing welfare. Middle-aged residents, those who bore the primary responsibility for maintaining the village's prosperity and stability, rested from their labours with the satisfaction of duties performed and obligations met. Their dreams reflected the complex satisfactions of lives fully engaged with meaningful work, loving relationships and community service. The village itself seemed to breathe with the rhythm of its sleeping inhabitants, the old buildings settling into deeper quiet, the streets empty except for the occasional cat making its nocturnal rounds or the rare night bird calling from somewhere in the mist-shrouded gardens. Even the animals seemed affected by the atmospheric conditions and the community's collective surrender to rest. The horses in their stables dozed peacefully, secure in their warm shelter and confident in their master's care. The cattle in the surrounding fields had long since settled into the patient rest that characterized their nights, their large forms barely visible through the mist, but radiating the contentment of creatures well fed and properly tended. The sheep on the distant hills, those descendants of the flocks that had first traced the paths later followed by human settlers, had found shelter in the lee of stone walls and hedgerows, their woolly coats providing insulation against the cool dampness that accompanied the mist. They were the most ancient inhabitants of this landscape, the living links to a pastoral tradition that stretched back into prehistory. Dogs throughout the village had settled into the deep sleep that came to animals secure in their place within human families, their keen senses alert even in sleep to any threat to their beloved households, but relaxed in the knowledge that this was a night for rest rather than vigilance. The mill wheel continued its eternal turning, powered by water that had been flowing through this valley since the last ice age, its steady rhythm providing a constant background to the village's dreams. The wheel was more than just a mechanical device. It was a symbol of the relationship between human ingenuity and natural force, between individual creativity and cosmic rhythm. Eleanor's pottery workshop, dark now except for the faint glow of banked coals in her kiln, held within its walls the results of centuries of human creativity, vessels that would outlast their makers and serve future generations with the same faithfulness that characterized all well-crafted things. The clay itself had been drawn from local deposits, transformed by fire and human skill into objects that embodied both practical utility and aesthetic beauty. Dr. Ashford's cottage, with its combination of medical facility and private residence, represented the community's commitment to caring for the health and welfare of all its members. His instruments and medications, his accumulated knowledge and experience, his willingness to answer calls for help at any hour. These were part of the network of mutual support that made village life both possible and meaningful. Mrs. Pemberton's shop, closed now but filled with the goods and supplies that sustained daily life, stood as testament to the complex relationships between individual enterprise and community welfare, between local production and global commerce, between traditional ways of life and modern innovations. The church, its ancient stones weathered by centuries of seasons but still standing firm against time's erosion, provided spiritual anchor for a community that understood the importance of connecting individual lives to larger purposes and eternal truths. The building itself was a symbol of continuity, linking present residents to countless generations of previous inhabitants who had worshipped within its walls and been buried in its surrounding yard. The village green, that small patch of common land that served as the community's heart, lay hidden beneath the mist but remained central to the village's identity and self-understanding. It was here that public celebrations took place, where announcements were made, where the informal democracy that governed village affairs found its most visible expression. The surrounding fields and gardens, invisible now in the thick mist but essential to the community's prosperity, held within their soil the accumulated fertility of centuries of careful cultivation. The crops and vegetables, the fruit trees and herb gardens, the pastures that supported livestock, all represented the patient work of generations of farmers and gardeners who had understood that the land was not just a resource to be exploited, but a trust to be maintained for future generations. As the night reached its deepest point and the mist achieved its maximum density, the village seemed to exist in a realm outside ordinary time and space. The atmospheric conditions had created a boundary between Millbrook and the rest of the world, making it feel like a place apart, a refuge from the larger forces of change and disruption that were transforming British society and indeed the entire world. This was a night that would be remembered by those who experienced it, not because anything dramatic or unusual occurred, but because it perfectly embodied the qualities that made village life meaningful and satisfying. The peace, the security, the sense of belonging to something larger than oneself, the satisfaction of work well done and relationships well maintained. All these were intensified by the atmospheric conditions and the community's collective surrender to rest. Morning would eventually come, bringing with it the return of ordinary light and familiar landscapes, the resumption of daily activities and regular responsibilities. The mist would lift, revealing once again the honey-coloured cottages and well-tended gardens, the cobblestone streets and ancient buildings that made Millbrook one of England's most beautiful villages. But the memory of this night would linger, providing spiritual sustenance during times of difficulty, offering reassurance that some things in the world remained constant and reliable despite the accelerating pace of change. The villagers would return to their work refreshed and renewed, their sense of community strengthened by shared experience, their commitment to maintaining their way of life deepened by recognition of its precious and fragile nature. The mist itself would eventually dissipate, absorbed by the warming air as morning sun burned through the clouds, but its influence would remain, woven into the village's collective memory, part of the rich tapestry of shared experience that bound the community together across generations and seasons. And so the village of Millbrook slept on, dreaming dreams of continuity and peace, of work well done and communities well served, of the eternal rhythms that sustained human life in harmony with the natural world. The mist continued its gentle dance, weaving through streets and around cottages, connecting past and present in its soft embrace, reminding all who witnessed its beauty that some places in this world would always be home to the human spirit. In this place where time moved like honey and every footstep echoed with centuries of peaceful wandering, where the ancient and the modern found perfect balance, where individual lives contributed to something larger and more enduring than personal ambition, the deepest satisfactions of human existence could still be found and treasured and passed on to future generations who would continue the eternal work of building communities worthy of the human soul. So ends our gentle stroll through the misty lanes of Millbrook, where tonight we discovered that peace is not the absence of activity, but the presence of harmony. That community is not the surrender of individuality, but its highest expression. That home is not merely a place, but a way of being in the world that honours both human needs and natural wisdom. If you found comfort in this quiet village tale, let me know what stories you'd like to hear next. Perhaps another evening in a different time and place, or maybe a return to these same cobblestone streets when spring brings new life to the Cotswold hills. Should we explore a Victorian London drawing room where mysteries unfold by gaslight, or venture to a medieval monastery where monks copy manuscripts by candlelight? Maybe journey to a colonial American tavern, where revolutionaries plan their dreams of freedom, or visit a Renaissance Italian villa where artists and philosophers gather to debate beauty and truth. The choice is yours, dear listener. But before we part ways for the evening, let us take one final walk through the sleeping village, one last gentle journey through the mist-wrapped streets of Millbrook as the night reaches its most profound depth. The clock in the church tower, that ancient timekeeper whose chimes had marked the hours for generations of villagers, struck midnight with a sound that seemed muffled and distant, as if the mist had wrapped eventime itself in its soft embrace. The 12 solemn notes drifted through the thick air, reaching each cottage like whispered reminders that the deepest part of night had arrived, that sacred time when the world belonged to dreams and rest. In the rectory, where Reverend Thornfield had finally set aside his sermon preparations and surrendered to sleep, the sound of the midnight chimes mingled with his gentle breathing and the soft, settling sounds of his old house. His dreams carried the themes he had been contemplating for Sunday's service. The parable of the talents, the gifts that each villager brought to their community, the way that individual abilities flourished when shared in service to the common good. The Reverend's study, where he had spent countless hours crafting sermons that spoke to the real concerns of rural life, held within its book-lined walls the accumulated wisdom of theological reflection, adapted to practical needs. His library was smaller than Mrs. Thornton's, but no less precious, filled with volumes that had shaped his understanding of how spiritual truths could illuminate daily existence and give meaning to ordinary work. Tonight, as mist pressed against his study windows and transformed familiar views into something mysterious and otherworldly, the room seemed to hold a special peace. The books themselves appeared to rest, their knowledge temporarily set aside in favour of the deeper wisdom that came only through sleep and dreams. Even the most profound human insights needed periodic renewal through contact with the unconscious sources of creativity and understanding. The church itself, that ancient stone sanctuary that had weathered centuries of seasons and served generations of worshippers, stood like a spiritual anchor in the mist-wrapped village. Its thick walls, built by medieval craftsmen who understood that sacred spaces required permanence and strength, enclosed an interior that remained unchanged despite the passage of centuries. The wooden pews, worn smooth by countless congregations, held the impressions of families who had worshipped here for generations. The Fletcher family pew, where James and Mary sat each Sunday with their children. The Pemberton pew, where Mrs. Pemberton maintained her dignified solitude while participating fully in community worship. The Ashworth pew, where Mrs. Dorothy and her nephew Timothy continued family traditions that stretched back to the church's founding. The altar, carved from local stone by craftsmen whose names had been forgotten, but whose skill lived on in every perfectly fitted joint and gracefully curved detail, supported vessels and furnishings that connected present worship to ancient traditions. The communion cup, fashioned by a silversmith in Gloucester 2 centuries earlier, reflected candlelight with the soft gleam of precious metal made precious not by its monetary value, but by its role in sacred ritual. The stained glass windows, though invisible now in the darkness and mist, held within their coloured panes stories that had provided spiritual instruction and aesthetic pleasure for generations of villagers. During daylight hours, they transformed ordinary sunlight into something approaching the divine, casting patterns of coloured illumination that changed with the seasons and the hours, creating a constantly shifting display of beauty that never failed to inspire wonder and reverence. Tonight, those same windows served as barriers between the sacred interior and the mist-wrapped world outside, preserving within the church a space of perfect stillness and peace. The building itself seemed to breathe with the rhythm of centuries, its ancient stones holding memories of countless services, baptisms, weddings, and funerals that had marked the passages of village life. The churchyard, where generations of villagers rested beneath weathered headstones, was now completely invisible in the thick mist. But the presence of those who'd gone before could still be felt, a reminder that the current residents of Millbrook were temporary custodians of something that would outlast them all. The names carved in stone, Hartwell and Fletcher, Pemberton and Ashworth, Wickham and Thornfield, represented not endings but continuations, threads in a tapestry that stretched from the distant past into an unimaginable future. The yew trees that stood sentinel over the graves had witnessed the passage of centuries, their evergreen branches providing year-round symbols of life's persistence in the face of apparent death. Tonight their dark forms were barely visible through the mist, but their presence could be sensed by anyone who understood that some things endured regardless of weather or visibility. As the midnight hour settled more deeply over the village, the mist seemed to achieve its maximum density, creating an atmosphere of perfect enclosure and protection. Millbrook felt completely separate from the outside world, existing in its own sphere of peace and quietude, a place where time moved at its own pace and human life continued according to rhythms that had been established centuries earlier. The mill wheel, that faithful servant of gravity and flowing water, continued its steady turning despite the late hour and thick atmospheric conditions. The sound it made, a gentle splash and creak, provided a constant background rhythm that seemed to embody the persistence of human industry in harmony with natural forces. The wheel had turned through countless misty nights like this one, had provided power for human purposes while respecting the essential character of the stream that drove it. Eleanor's workshop, dark now except for the faint glow of carefully banked coals in her kiln, held the promise of tomorrow's creative work. The clay that waited on her shelves would soon be transformed by her skilled hands into vessels that would serve practical needs while expressing artistic vision. The potter's wheel, silent now but ready for tomorrow's work, represented the ancient partnership between human creativity and natural materials that had produced useful beauty for thousands of years. The tools of her trade, the wooden ribs for shaping clay, the wire tools for cutting and trimming, the brushes for applying glazes, rested in perfect order, maintained with the care that craftspeople reserved for implements that were extensions of their own hands and minds. Each tool had its own history, its own contribution to the works of art that emerged from Eleanor's workshop, its own role in the larger process of transforming raw earth into objects of lasting value. The kiln itself, built according to specifications that had been refined through generations of potters, waited with the patience of fire temporarily contained but not extinguished. Tomorrow it would roar to life again, reaching temperatures that would complete the transformation of clay into ceramic, of artistic vision into tangible reality. Tonight it rested, its banked coals glowing softly like the village's own heart, maintaining the essential spark that would kindle tomorrow's creative fire. Dr. Ashford's cottage, with its combination of private residence and medical facility, represented the community's commitment to caring for the health and welfare of all its members. His surgery, equipped with the most modern instruments available to rural practitioners, stood ready to meet whatever medical emergencies the coming day might bring. His medicines, carefully organised and regularly replenished, provided tools for healing that previous generations of village physicians could only have dreamed of possessing. The medical journals that lined his shelves contained the accumulated knowledge of practitioners from around the world, insights that had been shared freely among physicians who understood that healing was a collaborative endeavour that transcended national boundaries and professional rivalries. Dr. Ashford's correspondence with colleagues in other districts had enriched his own practice while contributing to the larger advancement of medical knowledge. His horse Patience, resting comfortably in her stable behind the cottage, embodied the partnership between human healing and animal service that had made rural medical practice possible for centuries. Her steady reliability, her ability to navigate difficult terrain in all weather conditions, her patient waiting during long medical consultations, these qualities made her as essential to the community's health as any medicine or surgical instrument. The stable itself, with its sweet smell of hay and leather, its carefully maintained harness and equipment, its provision for the animal's comfort and security, represented the kind of attention to detail that characterised all aspects of village life. Nothing was too small to deserve proper care, no contribution too humble to merit respect and appreciation. Mrs. Pemberton's shop, closed now but filled with the goods and supplies, that sustained daily life stood as testament to the complex relationships that bound individual enterprise to community welfare. Her inventory represented not just commercial transactions, but a deep understanding of human needs, seasonal requirements, and the delicate balance between local production and imported necessities. Even the village cats, now making their nocturnal rounds through mist-shrouded gardens and alleyways, served essential functions in maintaining the balance between human habitation and the natural world. Their hunting prowess controlled rodent populations that would otherwise threaten stored grain and growing crops, their independence providing lessons in self-reliance, their affection offering comfort and companionship to human families. The dogs that slept peacefully in cottage kitchens and stable yards represented loyalty and protection, the willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for the welfare of others, the kind of devotion that made homes secure and families complete. Their alert senses, even in sleep, provided security against threats that human senses might miss, their warm presence offering comfort during long winter nights. As the deepest hour of night settled over Millbrook, bringing with it the most profound peace the village had known in months, every inhabitant, human and animal alike, seemed to rest in perfect harmony with the natural rhythms that governed all life. The mist continued its gentle dance, weaving through streets and around buildings, connecting all living things in its soft embrace. This was a night that embodied everything that made village life precious and worth preserving. The sense of belonging to something larger than oneself, the satisfaction of work well done in service to community needs, the comfort of knowing that individual lives contributed to patterns of meaning that would outlast any single generation. Morning would eventually come, bringing with it the return of ordinary light and familiar responsibilities. But the memory of this perfect night would remain, woven into the village's collective consciousness, providing spiritual sustenance during difficult times and renewing the commitment to maintaining the values and traditions that made places like Millbrook havens of peace in an increasingly turbulent world. Until then, may your dreams be filled with the same peace that settles over sleeping villages on misty autumn nights. May your rest be as deep as that found in the honey-coloured cottages, and may you wake refreshed and ready to contribute your own verse to the great poem of human community. Sleep well, dear listener, and dream of cobblestone streets where time moves like honey, and every footstep echoes with centuries of peaceful wandering. That's the end of tonight's story. Are you drifting off beneath the velvet skies of Istanbul, the gentle winds of Santorini, the lantern-lit streets of Hoi An, or the calm riversides of Bruges? If this tale brought a hush to your thoughts, like the episode and subscribe for more serene nights like this. Let the night carry you. Let your dreams find their way. Sleep softly now, wherever you are in this endlessly beautiful world.